This video is sponsored by Squarespace. In 1965, Frank Herbert's epic science fiction novel Dune was released. Though initially rejected over 20 times by other publishers, the novel went on to receive widespread acclaim, multiple awards, and became one of, if not the best-selling science fiction novel of all time. Not only did its fantastical world, huge ensemble of characters, and inventive concepts capture the imagination of readers, but filmmakers as well. Long before blockbusters like Star Wars, the task of translating the book to the big screen was thought to be impossible. But after multiple failed attempts, in the 1980s, a movie version of this unfilmable work finally made it to the big screen. It wasn't long before various attempts were made at translating Dune into movie form. The first attempt came in the same decade the book was published, when none other than Roger Corman tried to secure the rights, aiming to shoot the movie in Turkey. This project, however, was a non-starter. The next attempt at a film production was in 1971, when the rights were optioned by producer Arthur P. Jacobs, who had produced the Planet of the Apes film franchise. He pursued Lawrence of Arabia director David Lynch to helm the project. Progress was slow, however, and after Jacobs suffered a sudden fatal heart attack, the project was shelved indefinitely. In December 1974, producer Jean-Paul Gibbon purchased the rights for a new adaptation, famously to be directed by Alejandro Jodorowsky. This version of Dune has often been referred to as one of the greatest movies never made. Jodorowsky's adaptation was to be a 10-hour-long feature film, with a cast that included Salvador Dali, David Carradine, Udo Kier, Mick Jagger, and Orson Welles. He had assembled a team of star concept artists, which included Jean Mobius Gerard, Chris Foss, and H.R. Giger, as well as Dan O'Bannon to supervise the visual effects. While Jodorowsky's adaptation made some big departures from its source material, author Frank Herbert was said to be quite excited by the adaptation. However, due to difficulties in raising the budget and finding distribution, Jodorowsky's version never saw the light of day. The details of the outlandish production have been covered in depth in the excellent documentary Jodorowsky's Dune, which I highly recommend. It has been suggested over the years that producer Dino De Laurentiis used his influence in Hollywood to effectively sabotage Jodorowsky's adaptation in the hope of making his own. Whether this was true or not, by the time the rights became available again, De Laurentiis quickly picked them up after the Jodorowsky version collapsed. Ridley Scott was brought on to direct in 1979 following the success of Alien, which H.R. Giger and Dan O'Bannon also worked on. Frank Herbert himself was hired to write a draft of the screenplay, but he admittedly found writing for the screen quite difficult, and turned in his draft, which was 175 pages long. As a new, shorter draft was being written, Ridley Scott had to drop out of the project due to the sudden death of his older brother. Dropping out of Dune would eventually lead Scott to directing Blade Runner. The next director who caught De Laurentiis' eye was not a blockbuster filmmaker but David Lynch, best known at the time for directing The Elephant Man. Off the back of Elephant Man's success, George Lucas had offered Lynch the chance to direct The Return of the Jedi, which Lynch declined, having little interest in the job. Dune, however, intrigued him.
The day I finished reading the book, I met with Dino in his office, and I was so high from finishing the books and so thrilled with what I'd read, I signed on.
He initially worked with two co-writers, but as development continued, Lynch became sole writer and director. Once Dune was up and running with a director, Dino De Laurentiis actually handed over much of the day-to-day work of running the production over to his daughter, Rafaela De Laurentiis. At 32 years old, she was one of the youngest female producers working in the industry at the time, though she was unaware of this.
I think when you're young, ignorance of sometimes make you achieve greatness, because you just don't know any better, and so you say, okay, well, so sure, I'll produce Dune. I want to produce Dune. Then, it's only 10 years later that I found out that no woman had ever produced, before Dune, any movie that the budget was over $5 million. I had no idea.
For the production design of the film, Anthony Masters, the Oscar-winning designer of 2001: A Space Odyssey, was brought on board. Masters had been asked by George Lucas to work on Star Wars, but he had to pass on the offer due to scheduling conflicts. Therefore, when Dune came along, he jumped at the chance. Although the art department had been given the concept art created for Jodorowsky's Dune and Ridley Scott's version, Masters and Lynch decided to start from scratch. They wanted Dune to look nothing like any previous science fiction film, especially Star Wars. For the costumes of the film, Lynch approached Bob Ringwood, who had worked on John Boorman's Excalibur. Taking cues from Lynch, Ringwood went with a 1940s inspired look for the film. This is especially apparent in the Atreides and Imperial costumes. The Fremen still suits were made up of foam rubber pieces, which mimicked the forms of human musculature. Full body casts were taken of the main actors to properly fit each suit to each actor. Because much of the shoot would take place in the Mexican desert, an elaborate cooling system was built into the suit. Once the finished suits were sprayed down with dust and sand, they were ready for filming. This video is sponsored by Squarespace, the ultimate tool for creating your own beautiful website. I recently redesigned my website galaxyclasspictures.com using Squarespace's cutting-edge design tools like Blueprint AI, which helped me generate a brand new personalized template, which I then customized using Squarespace's easy-to-use Fluid engine. Squarespace also helps with your site's discoverability with their built-in SEO and domain name features. You can optimize your website so it shows up more often in searches and secure your ideal domain name. No extra fees and no add-ons required. Jump over to Squarespace using the link below to start building your website and use the coupon code RowanJColeman to get 10% off your first purchase. Many actors were considered for the role of Paul Atreides, including Tom Cruise, Kevin Costner, Val Kilmer, Kenneth Branagh, and Rob Lowe. Kilmer was in fact the frontrunner for the longest time, even being fitted for blue contact lenses at one point. Eventually then 25-year-old Kyle MacLachlan landed an audition which impressed the producers. As it turned out, MacLachlan was an enormous fan of Dune, and before accepting the role, he interviewed David Lynch to make sure the movie would do justice to the novel. After his talk with Lynch, MacLachlan accepted the part. Playing Paul's mother, Lady Jessica, was Francesca Annis. She made another foray into science fiction, playing the widow of the Web in Krull. To play Paul's father, Duke Leto Atreides, David Lynch was recommended German actor Jürgen Prochnow. At first, Lynch was hesitant, feeling an American actor was more appropriate. It was only after Lynch saw Prochnow in the acclaimed Das Boot did he agree Prochnow was right for the role. Dean Stockwell was another huge fan of the novel and pursued Lynch for a role in the film. John Hurt had originally been cast as Dr. Yue, but had to drop out due to scheduling conflicts. Thus, Stockwell won the role. Hollywood star Aldo Ray was originally cast as Gurney Halleck, but lost the role when he was arrested in Mexico for assault. Scrambling to find a replacement, Lynch thought of an actor he had seen in Excalibur, Patrick Stewart. This was the first production Stewart had done on the other side of the Atlantic, and relished the opportunity to work alongside his idol Max von Sydow, and became fast friends with Kyle MacLachlan. Richard Jones was brought in to read for several different parts before being cast as Swordmaster Duncan Idaho. Freddie Jones had previously appeared in Lynch's film The Elephant Man, and won the role of Thufir Hawat, the Atreides Mentat. To play the leader of House Harkonnen, the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, the producers initially sought out Orson Welles, who had been cast in the role for Jodorowsky's version. Welles, however, flatly refused. Paul Smith was then asked to play the part, but in order to do so he would have to gain a lot of weight, which the actor didn't want to do. He eventually landed the role of the Beast Rabban. Instead, the producers approached Kenneth McMillan for the role, which he happily accepted. To play the Baron, McMillan wore a bulky fat suit which made it virtually impossible for the actor to walk. McMillan only managed a shuffle at most. Dune's casting director was already acquainted with musician and singer Sting, after he auditioned for a Francis Ford Coppola-produced project which never got off the ground. When it came time to cast the Baron's nephew, Fade, Sting was offered the part, which he accepted enthusiastically. Famously, Patrick Stewart apparently had no idea who Sting was.
Because I'd been there a couple of weeks before Sting arrived, and when he arrived, there was this kind of frisson everywhere. You know, the whole of Mexico City was abuzz that Sting was coming. And so the second or third day, we're just hanging out on the set, and him and me, and I say, "So you're a musician?" And he said, yep. And I said, what do you play? And I swear, I crossed my heart. This is absolutely great. And he said, bass. And I said, you know, I've often wondered, what is it like carrying that huge thing around with you everywhere you go? And you're like, are you a solo artist? And he said, no, I'm in a band. And I said, oh, what kind of band? He said, The Police. Folks, I said, you play in a police band?
Brad Dourif made his first of many appearances in the sci-fi genre as the Harkonnen Mentat Piter. Jack Nance, who had previously played the lead in Lynch's feature debut Eraserhead, was cast as the Harkonnen Guard Captain Nefud. Everett McGill was initially brought in for a much smaller role, but his agent convinced the producers to audition McGill for the Fremen leader Stilgar. He won the role soon after. Sean Young, who was an up-and-coming star at the time, landed an audition to play Shani, but due to some scheduling confusion missed the appointment. It was only thanks to a chance encounter with Dino and Rafaela on a plane later that day that she convinced them she could take on the role. Playing Paul's younger sister, Aaliyah, was then 5-year-old Alicia Witt. Despite how young she was, Witt was apparently able to grasp the dialogue quite easily, and enjoyed her time on the production. Making up the members of the ruling House Carino was Virginia Madsen as Princess Irulan, and playing the Padishah Emperor Shaddam IV was award-winning actor and director Jose Ferrer. Acclaimed Swedish actor Max von Sydow had previously worked with De Laurentiis as Ming the Merciless in Flash Gordon. He was cast as Dr. Kynes, the Imperial Ecologist. And finally, Welsh actress Sian Phillips was cast as the Bene Gesserit Reverend Mother. Filming took place mostly at Cherubusco Studios in Mexico City. A total of 80 sets were built across 16 sound stages, essentially taking over the entire complex. A 3-square-mile area of nearby desert was also cleared of vegetation, rocks, and wildlife for location filming. Despite the sweltering heat in the desert and the complexities of studio filming, spirits were generally high during production. The cast and crew were very passionate about the material, with each department having a copy of the original novel on hand at all times. To make the Baron fly, the special effects crew used a combination of wirework and crane arms. Extremely thin tungsten steel wires were used to hoist Macmillan into the air, and for close-up shots he would stand on the end of a crane. Other scenes required custom-built rigs. While a number of shots involving miniatures were completed in post-production, in-camera foreground miniatures were also used extensively. Partial sets were built at the Mexico City Stadium, which were then extended by large miniatures which lined up with the sets. This often meant mounting the camera on a platform a dozen or so meters high.
You would have a wall that's a real wall, built full size, and then he would come up and do his little teeny wall with all the details. Now, one is right here next to the camera, one is down there, but your eye is gonna put them together. But it takes an eye to do that.
While some motion-controlled cameras were used for a handful of optical composites, a great many miniature effect shots were captured entirely in camera. The destruction of Arakeen, the spice harvester explosion, and many of the sandworm shots were fully in camera. The worms themselves were elaborate puppets of various different scales. The worms proved extremely difficult to operate, and getting usable footage from the worm sequences was very challenging. To achieve the correct scale for the sand, the miniature team actually had to use incredibly small glass particles. Because this substance was dangerous to breathe, the crew often had to wear full PPE while working on the stage. For the personal shields, computer graphics were initially proposed, but the final shots had to be hand-animated. In order to achieve the distortion effect, each surface of the shield had to be printed separately and then recomposited back together. In total, it took 9 months to create the sequence. For the music of the film, De Laurentiis, perhaps inspired by Jodorowsky's notion of hiring a rock band for the score, in his case Pink Floyd, approached American rock band Toto. Toto came up with the main theme for the movie, mixing their combination of rock and electronica with an orchestra. Ambient music artist Brian Eno also contributed to the score, writing the Prophecy theme. When it came time to edit the film, Lynch had a 3-hour cut in mind, but when this was proposed to distributor Universal Pictures, they demanded a 2-hour cut instead. Lynch, along with the De Laurentises, went through the footage cutting out a number of scenes, filming new ones and adding in some narration. While Lynch was unhappy at having to remove so much material, his preferred 3-hour cut was never completed. A later extended TV version, which ran for over 3 hours, was later made without Lynch's approval. He requested his name be taken off this version, being credited under the infamous pseudonym Alan Smithee for director, and another pseudonym Judas Booth for writer. The editing process in general seemed to stir some doubts in Lynch, who began to wonder if he had sold out to some degree by taking on the project. Despite his trepidations, however, Dune was released on the 14th of December 1984. Dune is a movie I have a somewhat strange relationship with. I first saw it in my early teens, and I don't remember enjoying it all that much. Yet there is something fascinating about it, something which compelled me to re-watch the film numerous times and eventually inspired me to read the book. Dune is by no means without merit. It's a passion project through and through, lovingly made by a team of incredibly talented artists who moved heaven and earth to bring Frank Herbert's story to life. But if there's one word I'd use to sum up the issues with this particular adaptation, that word is compromised. The movie is frustrating in how absolutely stunning many elements of its production are, elements which are unfortunately let down by some other factor. The miniature work is genuinely incredible, but the optical compositing is rough to say the least. None of it has the dynamism of ILM's work on Star Wars, instead feeling slow and static by comparison. The time when Dune would have really blown away an audience with its sheer presentation was many years before its actual release. And for all the money spent on it, the world of Dune feels oddly small in scope. Much of the action is confined to interiors, which feel very claustrophobic as a result of the dark cinematography. Yet the desert scenes feel disconnected from everything else. It's as if the entirety of Arrakis is a handful of sand dunes, which could be thousands of miles away from any city or right next door. The viewer never gets a solid sense of place. The geography of these worlds is never concretely established beyond the confines of the bases and fortresses the majority of scenes occupy. This problem is really emblematic of the larger issues with the film's overall direction. Now, David Lynch is a truly brilliant filmmaker, but his strengths as a director lie in atmosphere, evocative imagery, characters, and working with actors. A valuable set of skills to bring to any production, but when it comes to making an epic sci-fi blockbuster, there are other skills required which it seems Lynch lacked.
That never bothered him, you know, the 2,000 people in the back. He was worried about what was in front of his lens, and sometimes that's what we had problems with, because, you know, I would have 2,000 extras in suits in the desert, and he was trying to shoot the close-up of Kyle's eye. And I said, David, you can shoot that eye, you know, in the studio anytime you want, but we got to shoot, that's why we're here out in the desert. David never really worried himself about that.
This is most apparent in the action sequences, which end up disjointed, prolonged, or awkwardly framed. When the Harkonnens attack Arrakis, the Baron is somehow already inside the fortress, having captured Leto, Jessica, and Paul before his army even arrives. In the final battle against the Emperor, the sequence essentially boils down to the Fremen shooting the Sardaukar from atop the sandworms until the Sardaukar run away. Where Lynch's strengths do come through, however, is with the characters and the cast. Despite Kyle MacLachlan being much older than Paul Atreides in the book, he and pretty much everyone else are perfect for their roles. MacLachlan delivers a star-making performance here, endearing, even charming during his introduction on Caladan, and totally commanding in his eventual rise to leader of the Fremen rebellion. The supporting cast are nearly all fantastic, an ensemble of veteran stage and screen performers elevating their relatively small parts to memorable heights. However, it's the Harkonnens who steal the show. Kenneth Macmillan is clearly having a blast as the Baron. Though this take on the character is a huge departure from the more subdued, calculating Baron seen in the book, Macmillan's performance as a disease-ridden, sadistic maniac makes for a villain that's truly detestable, but also thoroughly entertaining to watch. That same villainous glee is reflected in Sting's performance as Fade. Despite having very little dialogue, his constant smirking and wild eyes succeeds in building him up as a credible threat to Paul in their final duel, even though he actually does very little. There are some other uniquely Lynchian departures from the book which I actually think benefit the film. Small quirks like House Atreides having an odd affinity for pugs, the Mentats having mad eyebrows and bushy hair, and all the sickening contraptions which only serve to make House Harkonnen all the more hateable. I also think the weirding way being turned into a sonic weapon triggered by the spoken word is a pretty cool idea. Taken further, it could have led to some interesting places, but as it is, the sonic weapon concept spices up the action nicely. There are brilliant moments with almost every character in the movie. It's in these quieter moments where Lynch's Dune excels. The things which go unsaid, the dream sequences, the time when Dune embraces the truly weird and trippy. These are the times where the viewer can really soak up the film's unique atmosphere, which is bolstered by the excellent score. Toto's main theme is suitably epic with its punchy brass and drums, but also ethereal with its synthesizers and electric guitar. It delivers that epic sci-fi sound which the music of Star Trek and Star Wars are known for, but with its own distinct darker flavor. Brian Eno's work is also just as memorable for its meditative quality. His prophecy theme sounds truly transcendent. It's a shame though the moments where Dune works are often hampered by the incessant narration.
A hunter seeker. Can't get me if I don't move. It's too dark in here for it to see clearly.
Dune's problem is not that it doesn't explain its world properly, rather the film explains too much. The feudal system of the Imperium, why spice is important, the Emperor's conspiracy and the Spacing Guild's involvement, weirding modules, still suit, hunter seekers, the water of life, it's all covered to death, either in the dialogue between the characters or by each character's own internal monologue.
Far off in the control rooms of spice gas, traveling without moving.
What's especially annoying is when this narration is used to convey information which is clearly evident in the performances of the cast. We can see Jessica's relief that Paul survived the Reverend Mother's test, we can see Kynes being impressed by Leto's compassion, and yet the narration makes sure to clarify these things when there's no need.
My son lives.
I must admit, against all better judgment, I like this Duke.
It leaves nothing left to the audience to intuit, making it difficult for the viewer to become engrossed in the drama. Overall, it's fair to say Dune lacks excitement. It lacks a dramatic tension to propel the events forward. The fall of House Atreides is tragic, even shocking, but not very affecting. The second act, where Paul and Jessica are taken in by the Fremen, is more compelling. Paul's first ride on a sandworm is a real highlight of the film. Unfortunately, the sudden time jump at the start of the third act is almost whiplash-inducing. The real casualties here are Stilgar and Chani. We see the start of Paul and Stilgar's friendship forming, but the film skips over most of their actual relationship. Chani, for all her importance, barely factors into the film at all. Ultimately, Dune is too much novel to fit into one film without making some seriously big changes to the narrative. It may sound as though I'm being overly negative towards Dune, but as I said, there is something which keeps bringing me back to it. In a way, my relationship to the film is similar to Star Trek the Motion Picture. I'm aware of its flaws, but I can engage with the movie when I'm in the right headspace. The storytelling may not be very strong, but the imagery, atmosphere, and characters are what stay with you. A work of passion that fails will always be more admirable than a successful work of complacency. It did achieve one major thing for me personally, which is getting me to read the book. It expanded my horizons and inspired my imagination. The movie, for all of its problems, did succeed in capturing the spirit of Dune. In the lead up to the movie's release, De Laurentiis and Universal made a strong marketing push. In a possible attempt at replicating the success of Star Wars, a line of tie-in action figures was produced by LJN. However, like many LJN products, these toys were poorly made and only managed lackluster sales, something which didn't bode well for the movie itself. Upon release, Dune received largely negative reviews from critics. Many lambasted it as borderline incomprehensible and off-putting, and the film didn't fare much better at the box office. On a large budget of $45 million, Dune only managed to gross $30 million worldwide, making it a considerable box office bomb. While it did receive some accolades, such as an Oscar nomination for Best Visual Effects, Dune was widely regarded as a failure. The poor performance of the film was most keenly felt by David Lynch himself. For a time he withdrew into seclusion, feeling chiefly responsible for the movie's failure. In retrospect, he believed he had sold out in making the film in the first place, and vowed never to work on such a project again.
Dune is a huge, gigantic sadness in my life, because I did not have final cut on that film. Total creative control I didn't have. So the film is not the film that I would have made had I had that final control. So it's a bit of a sadness, and but I'm still happy that you like it, and I like many, many parts of Dune myself.
Despite its largely negative reception at the time, this first crack at adapting Dune to the big screen did accrue a passionate cult fanbase over the years. Although it may have been a flop at the box office and with critics, for many fans of the book, this was the definitive version of Dune outside the source material.
This, I think, is one of the linchpins of Dune's importance. That it ever actually got made. It was a book that shouldn't have been shot. It was a script that couldn't have been written. It was a directorial job that was beyond anyone's doing. It was a production that would beggar the imagination and bankrupt 3 studios. It was a production that could not possibly be marketed in any way that anyone could understand or that they would go to. It didn't hit its audience. It looked like it insulted its audience. It looked like it defamed its originator, and yet the film was made.
In fact, it was believed this fan base was strong enough that in the 90s the video games Dune 2 and Dune 2000 were released. As pioneering works in the real-time strategy genre, these games heavily leaned into the 84 movie's look and feel, especially in Dune 2000's FMV cutscenes. Over the years, many fan edits of the movie have been made, which attempt to restore some of the cut content, rearrange existing footage, or add new material to do justice to what Lynch had originally envisioned for the film. How successful these new cuts are in improving the film could be the subject of another video, but I think the efforts by fans to expand on the original film are commendable. Of course, more recently, Dune has returned to the big screen in the form of the 2-part epic directed by Denis Villeneuve. In contrast to the 1984 version, Dune Part 1 was a critical and commercial success, with Part 2 slated for release later this year at the time of writing. But even with this version, some still see the Lynch film as definitive. However, there were other Dune adaptations before Villeneuve made his stamp on the mythos. After the 1984 film, the next attempt at bringing Frank Herbert's world to life came in the year 2000. In the fallout of Dune 1984's failure at the box office, the film rights reverted back to the Frank Herbert estate, and hope for more Dune movies was seemingly dead in the water. However, by the following decade, executive producer Richard P. Rubinstein believed he had the answer. Rubinstein had tremendous success in the mid-90s, adapting the Stephen King novels The Stand and The Langoliers into hit television miniseries, and thought that perhaps Dune could see similar success in the format. He said, "I have found there's a wonderful marriage to be had between long, complicated books and the television miniseries. There are some books that just can't be squeezed into a 2-hour movie." Rubinstein's vision for a Dune miniseries aligned well with Sci-Fi Channel president Bonnie Hammer's ethos for the cable channel. For most of its early history, the Sci-Fi Channel licensed other shows and movies as opposed to making their own, airing reruns of Doctor Who and Star Trek. But by the mid-90s, Bonnie Hammer wanted to create original sci-fi programming, putting the channel on the map with blockbuster miniseries. It was this ethos which eventually led to the production of Steven Spielberg's Taken and the reimagined Battlestar Galactica. However, the Sci-Fi Channel's first miniseries was to be Frank Herbert's Dune. After the project was greenlit in November 1999, Rubinstein hired John Harrison, who had previously directed Tales from the Dark Side the movie, which Rubinstein had produced, to both write and direct the Dune miniseries. Harrison was a massive fan of the book, and sought to create a more faithful adaptation than the '84 version. That being said, Harrison did make some changes. Like the '84 version, Harrison chose to age up Paul Atreides to a young adult, rather than the 15-year-old he is in the books. The Weirding Way was also altered from martial art to include a super speed element. Harrison also chose to add a subplot of Princess Irulan investigating the fall of House Atreides, among other things. As with many big miniseries productions at the time, the project needed a star name to attract audience interest. Eventually they offered the role of Duke Leto Atreides to William Hurt. As it turned out, Hurt was a big science fiction fan and a Dune aficionado, and so he gladly accepted the part. As the production would be based in the Czech Republic, the rest of the cast were either British or European. Scottish actor Alec Newman won the role of Paul Atreides. Newman would later re-team with Hurt for another miniseries based on Frankenstein, and would make another foray into science fiction, appearing in Star Trek Enterprise. Playing Paul's mother, Lady Jessica, was English actress Saskia Reeves. Another Scottish actor, James Watson, was cast as the Atreides swordmaster Duncan Idaho. Other British cast members included Ian McNeice, who would later appear as Winston Churchill in Doctor Who, as the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, P.H. Moriarty as Gurney Halleck, Julie Cox as Princess Irulan, and Robert Russell as Dr. Yue. American actor Matt Kiesler was cast as the Baron's nephew, Fade, but Kiesler chose to affect a more transatlantic accent to more convincingly be related to McNeice's Baron. Most of the remaining cast members were local Czech actors. This included Barbara Kodatova as Shani, Karl Dobry as Liet Kynes, Laszlo Kish as Raban, Jan Vlask as Thufir Howard, Jan Unger as Piter, and Zuzana Gieslerova as Reverend Mother Gaius Helen Mohayam. Other international cast members included Italian actor Giancarlo Giannini as Padishah Emperor Shaddam IV, and German actor Uwe Ochsenecht as Stilgar. When it came to filming the series, the production initially looked at desert locations all over the world, including Tunisia and Morocco. While these countries had hosted numerous Hollywood productions before, on-location conditions would make shooting there prohibitively expensive. It was acclaimed cinematographer Vittorio Storaro who suggested shooting the miniseries entirely within a studio and creating the desert scenes using panoramic backdrops rather than green screens. It was a technique Storaro had used before on The Last Emperor and Dick Tracy, and so was confident it would work with Dune. John Harrison also saw it as an opportunity to create a desert location which literally couldn't be found anywhere on Earth. The series was shot in the Czech Republic at Prague's Barrandov Studios, which had and still has the largest sound stages in Europe. 3 enormous sets were constructed at the studios, depicting Getty Prime, Katan, and the city of Arakeen on Arrakis. The production design was handled by local Czech designer Milian Krejka Kliokovic. Much like the production design of the '84 film, Krejka wanted to give each world a distinct visual history. Arakeen was inspired largely by Moroccan architecture, Katan was given an Art Nouveau aesthetic, and Gidi Prime was a combination of German expressionism and brutalism, with bold reds and slanted angles. The costumes were designed by Theodor Pištek, who had previously won an Academy Award for his work on Amadeus. Pištek was initially uninterested in working on a science fiction project until John Harrison described the project as being more Shakespeare than Star Trek. For research, Pištek looked into the costume designs of Jean Girard aka Mobius, who originally worked on Jodorowsky's failed Dune adaptation. For the Fremen's blue eyes, actors were given contacts with a reflective coating which would glow bright blue when hit with an ultraviolet light. A full-scale ornithopter was built for the production, which doubled as every ornithopter seen in the series.
It's very, very nippy in the desert, thank you very much. Plush leather interior, CD, everything, the works. But there's no smoking, says the stewardess in said thopter. So these go.
This thopter was then recreated digitally by Dune's in-house visual effects team, led by VFX supervisor Ernie Farino. The VFX team used CGI to create various environments on Arrakis, as well as all of the planets, vehicles, and the giant sandworms. The music was composed by Graham Revell, known for his work on The Crow and The Mighty Morphin Power Rangers the movie. In contrast to the mix of synth, rock, and orchestra used in the '84 film, Revell went for a more acoustic score which utilised Middle Eastern drums and woodwinds. The orchestral elements of the score were performed by the City of Prague Philharmonic Orchestra. After a massive year-long production, the three-part miniseries Frank Herbert's Dune was released on the Sci-Fi Channel in December 2000. Compared to the 1984 movie, it's fair to say the Dune miniseries is far less compromised than David Lynch's version. The observation that a work like Dune is far better suited to a miniseries than a single movie is very much on point, and when I sat down to rewatch the miniseries for this video, I was immediately impressed by the quality of the script and the production. Part 1 is, for the most part, fantastic as an adaptation of the source material and as a piece of drama. Unlike the 1984 movie, dazzling as it was, the Dune universe really lives and breathes better in the miniseries than it ever did in the movie. The sets and costumes look as though they've been lifted right from the pages of a Mobius art book, and the world building is woven into the dialogue and action beautifully. Important aspects of the Dune universe, awkwardly whispered in jarring internal monologues in the '84 version, are effortlessly communicated in this miniseries. The whole presentation of the thing takes on a theatrical quality with its bold lighting and classical staging. The Shakespearean court intrigue by way of sci-fi epic really comes to life on screen in rich detail. The majority of the cast are very strong, particularly Carl Dobry as Liet Kynes. His methodical line delivery and reserved expressions creates a great sense of mystery around the character, at first appearing as a possible villain before letting us get a peek at the idealistic visionary underneath the secretive demeanour. Honestly, he steals the show whenever he's on screen, even from heavy hitters like William Hurt. Alec Newman as Paul Atreides is a little more inconsistent. While the character has been aged up from the books, it seems as though Paul is still written to be an impulsive teenager. It's quite jarring to see this clearly adult man storming off in a huff like a spoiled child.
One's fiercest competition comes from one's own kind. They eat from the same bowl.
That's not to say he's without charisma though, and his scene with Julie Cox's Princess Irulan is a real highlight of Part 1. The two of them fire off witty and insightful dialogue, demonstrating a spark of great chemistry between them. And later in the series, Newman excels as a powerful leader, exhibiting considerable gravitas and weight in his physicality and line delivery.
Without the spice, the navigators will become blind. The Bene Gesserit will lose all powers, and all commerce among the great houses will cease. Civilization will end. If I am not obeyed, the spice will not flow.
Not every casting choice is a bullseye, however. Although on paper the Baron is much closer to his depiction in the books, more of a conniving mastermind than the sadistic maniac seen in the Lynch film, Ian McNeice is frankly too nice a screen presence to really be great in the role. Not as repulsive as Kenneth Macmillan from the original film, but also not as intimidating as Stellan Skarsgård's portrayal in the 2021 version. The most strikingly miscast character, however, is Gurney Halleck. There's not really a nice way of saying this, the performance is just terrible.
Not in the mood? Mood is a thing for cattle and women, young pup. Mood is not for fighting.
P.H. Moriarty simply isn't convincing in the role in any capacity. Whereas the rest of the cast nail that operatic tone the source material demands, Moriarty sticks out like a sore thumb. And unfortunately, while Part 1 is very strong, Parts 2 and 3 are where the miniseries really starts to struggle. For as much money as was spent on the series, the longer the characters spend in the desert, the cheaper the production starts to look. To borrow a gaming term, the fidelity of the series quickly breaks down. The painted backdrop of the desert may work for one or two close-up shots, but once one notices the same sand dunes and mountains repeated dozens of times, the viewer becomes keenly aware that this is a set in a studio and not the fantastical landscape of Arrakis. Because the rest of the show has such high production value, the moment the illusion of Dune's world breaks, it shatters. On more than one occasion, the camera is placed in the wrong position, completely giving away the desert as a large painting, and in numerous shots, the seams between the pictures which make up the backdrop are clearly visible. A sense of place is crucially important to the story of Dune, and unfortunately, this failure to achieve that sense of place ends up bringing the series down as a whole. In a way, the script for parts 2 and 3 are perhaps too faithful to the source material. There's an attempt to try and include basically everything from the novel. Coupled with the addition of a subplot following Irulan, this unfortunately makes parts 2 and 3 a real slog to get through. The desire to flesh out Irulan's character is an understandable one, but ultimately her plotline doesn't accomplish anything of note. She discovers information the viewer already knows, and her amenability to Paul is already well established in part 1. And that excellent world building from part 1 ends up feeling like over-clarification in parts 2 and 3. In a strange way, the miniseries ends up running into the same problem as the 84 version. There's nothing left for the audience to intuit about this world or the story. Every element is rigorously explained in great detail for fear of leaving the viewer behind. Coupled with the limited amount of sets in the vast majority of the series ends up feeling like the same handful of conversations in the same handful of sets. It loses that epic quality part 1 was so successful in establishing. The narrative dragging its feet ends up hurting the climax of the series as well. The final battle, which should feel like a long-awaited payoff, ends up being too little too late. It doesn't help that the action in general is poorly captured and edited. The Harkonnen assault on House Atreides is literally only a minute long, and the rest of the skirmishes are let down by the obvious reuse of footage. This one warehouse is blown up repeatedly throughout the series. Thankfully, Paul's duel with Fade is more successful. The more complex choreography and clear coverage makes it a major improvement over the same scene from the 84 version. However, taken as a whole, the Dune miniseries is, in many ways, just as troubled as Lynch's film. Like that film, the miniseries is undeniably a work of passion by a team of people who deeply respected the source material, but whereas Lynch's film compromised on its creative vision to better fit popular trends, the miniseries has the opposite problem. It seeks to adapt the entirety of the novel in as much detail as possible, but in doing so the filmmakers seem to forget that what works on the page doesn't always work on the screen. The miniseries was actually my introduction to Dune, but it was the 1984 movie which got me to read the book. This just wasn't, and I'm afraid it still isn't, a version of Dune which I can connect with, though I'm happy to know the same isn't true for everyone. Upon release, Frank Herbert's Dune became one of the Sci-Fi Channel's highest-rated programs, bringing in over 4 million viewers for all 3 parts. The series was also generally well received by critics and audiences. While it was not universally praised, it was deemed a superior adaptation to the 1984 version. Like that version, the miniseries introduced a whole new generation to the Dune saga, many of whom still see this as the definitive adaptation. The Sci-Fi Channel's expensive gamble on Dune seemed to have worked, and unlike the 84 version, the Dune saga in this form would continue.
The saga of Dune is far from over.
When executive producer Richard P. Rubinstein first bought the rights to adapt Dune, he optioned the entire book saga, from the original Dune novel to the final Frank Herbert story, Chapterhouse Dune. The first miniseries had been a big success for the Sci-Fi Channel, bringing in high ratings and an Emmy win for its visual effects. Knowing the rights to the full saga was already secure, the Sci-Fi Channel again approached writer-director John Harrison about a sequel miniseries. Harrison was extremely enthusiastic about the prospect, but being a fan of the books, he didn't believe there was enough material in Dune Messiah alone for a 3-part miniseries. Therefore, he decided to merge both Dune Messiah and the third book, Children of Dune, into a single adaptation. Many of the first miniseries cast members returned for Children of Dune, including Alec Newman as Paul Atreides, Julie Cox as Princess Irulan, Barbara Kodatova as Chani, Ian McNeice as Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, Zuzana Gislerova as Reverend Mother Gaius Helen Mohiam, and P.H. Moriarty as Gurney Halleck. However, Saskia Reeves was unable to reprise her role as Lady Jessica due to pregnancy. Harrison's first choice for the role was originally Alice Krieger, but she had to turn the part down due to scheduling conflicts. When she was re-offered the part for Children of Dune, she accepted. Star Trek fans will know Krieger for her performance as the Borg Queen in Star Trek First Contact. Other replacements included Edward Atherton taking over the role of Duncan Idaho, and Steven Berkoff taking over the role of Stilgar. Carl Dobry, who originally played Liet Kynes in the first miniseries, was brought back in the new role of Korba. Like the previous miniseries, the production wanted a well-known movie star in the cast. For Children of Dune, Susan Sarandon was cast as Princess Wensekia. Sarandon was a huge fan of the Dune novels and jumped at the chance to be involved in the project. Other new cast members included Greek-German actress Daniela Amavia as Alia, English actress Jessica Brooks as Ganima Atreides, and Scottish actor James McAvoy in one of his early breakout roles as Leto Atreides. Production once again took place at Prague's Barrandov Studios in the Czech Republic. While John Harrison had written and directed the first miniseries, Children of Dune was directed by Greg Yaitanes, a veteran of both TV and film who continues to work on big-budget shows like House of the Dragon to this day. Famed cinematographer Vittorio Storaro, who had shot the first miniseries, was unavailable for the sequel series, and so was replaced by Polish cinematographer Arthur Reinhardt. The approach to the visual effects of Children of Dune was quite different to the first. Previously, the production had used large painted backdrops for the various desert scenes. However, for Children of Dune, all set extensions and environments would be created digitally. For the score, composer Brian Tyler replaced Graham Revell. In contrast to Revell's mix of percussion, woodwinds, and electronica, Tyler created an epic orchestral score, once again performed by the Prague Philharmonic Orchestra. A centerpiece of the score was the track Inama Nushif, the lyrics of which Tyler pieced together from Fremen phrases seen in the original books. After another demanding and lengthy production, Frank Herbert's Children of Dune premiered on the Sci-Fi Channel on the 16th of March 2003. It's slightly strange that pre-2021, the best adaptation of Dune was not even an adaptation of Dune itself, but its sequels. Children of Dune comfortably surpasses its predecessor series by quite some margin. The Dune universe is rendered with far more scope and believability than in the previous miniseries, mainly thanks to the new approach to directing, cinematography, and visual effects. The various sets depicting Arrakis and the other worlds, which felt limited and occasionally cheap-looking before, now feel like real places. Arrakeen especially feels authentically ancient and lived in. Arthur Reinhardt's choice of strong, directional lighting dominated by a single colour feels far more naturalistic, while also helping to distinguish the various locations from one another more clearly. Using a blue screen in place of in-camera backdrops also goes a long way in selling this world to the viewer. While the CGI certainly doesn't hold up and was far from convincing at the time, this change helps the series to better convey a sense of scope to the viewer. In Dune, once one noticed the same painted backdrops being reused over and over again, it shattered the illusion of this setting, turning this epic space opera into something closer resembling a high-end recording of a stage play. Though the digital environments in Children of Dune aren't photoreal, they ironically create a vaster canvas than the literal paintings used before. These locations have real depth and variety. Combined with the strong use of lighting and colour, Children of Dune has some truly striking images, at times resembling John Schoenherr's famous artwork. Greg Yaitanes also seems to have a much firmer grasp of handling the general scope of the story than John Harrison did. Whereas Dune often suffered from the heavy use of stock footage and poorly framed fight sequences, the action in Children of Dune is far more cohesive and engaging. The set pieces, battles, chases, and duels carry much more drama and character as well as clarity. This brings us to Children of Dune's biggest strength. It feels like an actual story being told, rather than an encyclopedia being recited. The elevated feel of the series is carried beautifully by Brian Tyler's spectacular score. As opposed to Graham Revell's work, which was mostly ambient music or fast percussion, Tyler uplifts the drama with sweeping, distinct melodic themes. It's no wonder the Summon the Worms track ended up in so many trailers. my previous retrospective, I mentioned how, in attempting to adapt more material from the book, the Dune miniseries often felt as if it was over-clarifying its world-building and plot elements. Children of Dune focuses squarely on the characters and their relationships. Alec Newman gives a measured and tragic performance as Paul Atreides. While the series is sympathetic to him, it also doesn't shy away from showing us how much of a dictator he has become.
Alia knows my mind. I forbid a constitution. Order in council this day, etc., etc. Irulan, are you taking this down?
Yes, my lord.
Even so, the viewer feels for his plight as a man cursed with foreknowledge, knowing everything he holds dear will be lost one day, something which he is both powerless to stop and unable to move beyond. Once again, Brian Tyler's score carries the standout sequence of the series with his piece In Amanu Shif. It's a scene of contrasts. It shows us a wonderful birth, a tragic death, and the ruthless slaughter of Paul's enemies. The music perfectly embodies this mix of emotions, turning Leto and Ganima's birth into something wondrous, making Chani's looming death all the more heartbreaking, and turning cold-blooded murder into a moment of exaltation. Part 2 isn't quite as strong. It veers into some of the same problems as the previous miniseries in being too faithful to the books. As this is an adaptation of 2 books, Part 2 can't help but feel like the series is starting over again, losing the momentum built up in Part 1. There are also extraneous plot threads which don't amount to anything, such as House Carino kidnapping a sandworm. It's a cool scene, but the payoff to this thread doesn't happen until a later story, so it feels like an odd inclusion in this series given the amount of time it takes up. That being said, Part 2 is anchored by the charisma of James McAvoy's Leto and Jessica Brooks's Ganima. The charisma of both actors is only offset by the sense that the twins are somehow dangerous. It's their evident intelligence mixed with their youthful impertinence, the way they read people, almost finishing each other's sentences.
For a moment, you almost imagined that's who we were.
Didn't you? You almost let yourself believe that we were father and mother.
Part 3, however, is where the rest of the cast shines. Alice Krieger gives a more reserved performance than Saskia Reeves, but is just as well cast. Her steely demeanour is something which made her well suited to playing villains like the Borg Queen, but Krieger's Jessica is just as passionate and caring as the character was in the first miniseries. Susan Sarandon is clearly having a ball as the villainous Princess Wensikia. She hams it up nicely as she plots from the shadows, becoming almost giddy at the prospect of House Atreides' demise. The character is a borderline caricature, but it's Sarandon's commitment to the bit which makes the performance so compelling. Meanwhile, Daniela Amavia as Alia is at her best when she's at her most unhinged. Alia's transformation from an overburdened outcast to a brutal dictator also gives the returning Ian McNeice a chance to shine. While not as demented as Kenneth Macmillan's Baron or as intimidating as Stellan Skarsgård in the most recent film, McNeice's Baron excels in his insidiousness. Although he often berates and manipulates Alia from the shadows, he takes a perverse delight in knowing he's the only voice Alia can bear to listen to. Rather than taking great pains to ensure no one in the audience is left behind by the complexity of its plot or the strangeness of its world, Children of Dune knows that to succeed as sci-fi Shakespeare, the viewer has to care about the characters. If one hasn't read the books, they likely have no idea what the Golden Path is or what exactly being pre-born means, but the trade-off is having a more complete understanding of the emotional core of the story. The most impressive feat this miniseries pulls off is that, unlike the previous adaptations, Children of Dune manages to cut through the noise and finds the heart of Dune. Just like the first miniseries, Children of Dune was met with ratings success and awards buzz, and this time the critical and audience reception was even more positive. Particular praise was given to the visual effects and performances of cast members like Susan Sarandon and James McAvoy. One would think, given the success of both miniseries, that the third would follow suit. However, a miniseries adapting further Dune novels never came to be. The reasons for this are nebulous and difficult to find solid information on. Considering these two miniseries encapsulate the first Dune trilogy, and writer John Harrison saw Children of Dune as the conclusion of the story of House Atreides, it's possible Harrison didn't intend to make any more beyond Children of Dune. Then again, the huge expense of both productions may also have been a factor. Despite the strong ratings for both miniseries, these were not in-house productions at the Sci-Fi Channel, and so the network heads may not have seen as large a return on investment as they had hoped. This is mostly speculation though, as again, information about a possible third Dune miniseries is virtually non-existent. For whatever reason, another Dune miniseries never got off the ground, and for the most part, the Sci-Fi Channel adaptations were quickly forgotten, as opposed to the 1984 movie, which maintained a strong cult following. Of course, Dune did return to the big screen in 2021, with the first part of Denis Villeneuve's epic two-part adaptation. Compared to the previous efforts, this version of Dune is easily the most successful, critically, commercially, and in terms of pop culture impact. For the longest time, Dune languished in relative obscurity when compared to works like The Lord of the Rings, which was also considered unfilmable for many decades. At the time of writing, Part 2 won't be released until next year, but if Part 1 is anything to go by, this is easily the best adaptation we've had so far. Though some book fans may take issue with the absence of certain elements, the filmmaker's choice to dispense with the peripheral material and focus on telling Paul's story is a wise one. Part of Dune's unfilmable reputation has had a lot to do with its seemingly impenetrable world. Yet one of the reasons previous adaptations failed was because they dumped so much nitty-gritty world-building onto the audience when it really wasn't necessary. The film uses exposition carefully and intelligently. Elements which are crucial to the plot are given the most amount of attention, whereas the larger world building, the Imperium's power structure, personal shield combat, mentats, etc., are conveyed visually, inviting the viewer into the world rather than telling them to sit there and listen. The result is a movie which not only looks great, but also encapsulates the themes and emotions of the story within Paul's journey. To make another Lord of the Rings comparison, the 1984 movie can be likened to Ralph Bakshi's animated effort, lovingly made, reverent of the source material, but ultimately too compromised and off-putting to be truly successful. Whereas the 2021 version is the equivalent to Peter Jackson's celebrated trilogy, capturing the heart of the story in vivid detail, while making intelligent changes here and there to ensure audiences get as much entertainment as they do philosophy. Speaking personally, I can't wait to see Part 2 next year. If you enjoyed this video, consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel to stay up to date on future uploads. You can see videos early, uncut and ad-free by joining me on Patreon. I'd like to thank all of my current patrons and members, with an ultra thanks to Evan, Eamon Kelly, Michael Hardy, County Ark, Mike Halsey, Olivia Computer, Bano, Tom, Director Kate, Patrick Fleming, Matthew Camille, Lilac Yene, Ed Mark Starr, Extreme Streamers, Howard Craig Kervik, and AS Caging 101. Thank you once again for watching. Have a good one.